Well, thanks so much for having me on. Um, as you've touched on my background, I did work in crime TV, from Court TV to Nancy Grace's show for almost 20 years. So I am considered like an expert on murder in America. And we did see some of the worst cases, some that are not as high profile as others that were actually the details of the cases are just awful. And I guess using just bouncing off the word evil, when I first started working at Court TV, I used to just think anyone who murdered someone was crazy. And then as you get to see how they think by watching their trials, watching how they are in court, just all of the way all these trials and murder cases play out, you realize that that's not true, that some people are just pure evil. And I think the average person's fascination with true crime and why it's blown up so much and it ebbs and flows, but now it's at a peak, is that it's the one part of human behavior that a normal person can't understand, how someone could be so sadistic with a stranger, or and some of the brutality we've seen is just next level crazy. And I think in a safe way, people like to scare themselves. That's why horror movies are popular. That's why reading books, you're curled up at home watching it and getting a sort of a vicarious thing out of it, but you don't feel like you're yourself or in danger. But I think when people watched Court TV, they were seeing real cases and real trials, and they realized that, like the tagline, I always say, like, if you're not paranoid, you're not paying attention. That's sort of like a tagline in my head, because it just is meaning that there are dangers out there, and a lot of people, we became so hyper vigilant because all we did was cover crime. But an average person probably doesn't have this on their mind all the time. But when you are in that world, we just all did become very paranoid, and we were always looking around before we got into a car. And there's like a list of basic safety things you can do, but sometimes people are just in a bad situation and they can't get out of it.
So stay on that fascination that we have. How have you seen the public's consumption of and this reaction to true crime content evolve over your career? I mean, you've done this for a few decades, especially though with the rise of digital media and streaming platforms.
Well, like Netflix, like the Dahmer thing that was on Netflix was their highest rated thing ever. And when
Really?
we Dahmer was one of the first. I started at Court TV just after we did Dahmer, but I got very friendly with Jerry Boyle, who is Dahmer's attorney, and we were surprised when the Dahmer thing took off the way it did, because Dusty was like old news, like we had covered that case to death, over such a long period of time. But then we realized, to a lot of kids these days, whether it's a Gen Z or a millennial, they never heard of Jeffrey Dahmer. They were just born or whatever. So, but it had the same appeal to that group of people as it did to us 20 years ago. And I think that that was one, obviously a terrible case, but it's understandable how it got notoriety. And yes, it's so easy to stream these things, and there's so much content on all these Netflix and all these streaming services, digital, online. I think that if you just Google true crime, God knows what pops up. It must be a million different cases and things. So I think it has certainly contributed to the ease of getting all the information, or just, you could find a case you would never even be able to find necessarily. Put in a few keywords to search, and you could learn about things you might never, encounter.
It feels like the podcasts, every couple of weeks, there's this new 12-part series into some grisly crime
Yeah.
somewhere. And one of the things that has always kind of made me scratch my head is why the demographic, as reported, tends to be mostly women for those podcasts. Why is that?
We've analyzed all this stuff, that the vast majority of murders are committed by men, but more women watch murder shows, stream stuff, read books, and are authors. There's an organization called Sisters in Crime.
Oh, really?
Um, yeah, and there's a national one, and then there are different state chapters, and there are a lot of women authors that write thrillers. I think it used to be more men. Now it seems like it's overwhelmingly women. So women seem to like to write about it, read about it, watch it, but they don't commit it. They only commit it, like men. If I'm getting off on a tangent, let me know.
It's all
But
right. Keep going.
men tend to kill a lot of times, like Dennis Rader, who's BTK. He said he was driven by sexual impulses. A lot of them say that. um, Women tend to kill from an emotional standpoint. They usually either kill their spouses, boyfriends, significant others who were abusing them, or they kill their children, sadly enough. but they're both of those elements have emotional components. Men tend to be motivated by sexual stuff, and women in murder tend to be motivated by emotional stuff. And it is a very interesting dynamic when you really start to think about, all of that, all those distinctions and differences. It is very interesting.
Let's go back a little bit. Having worked closely with figures like Lily Tomlin and George Carlin, I'm super jealous. Before diving into the world of crime reporting, how did those early career experiences influence your approach to storytelling in true crime genre?
Well, I think Lily would always, we used to go out after the show, and she never turned it off. She was always making notes on napkins if we went to like some kind of late show in the city in New York, and I used to watch her, and she was always making notes and observing people and getting ideas for her next routines and things. George, they're both, people who know I work for both of them. They are both into I mean, George is obviously not with us anymore, but they were both, and Lily still is, very intellectual comedians, and there is a very parallel similarity to the way they approach their craft, and they're both, people throw the word comedic genius around, or genius around in general, but I do think the two of them
I
really
would.
were. Because I watched George on stage so many times that I watched Lily like an insane amount of times, and you could watch her do the same routine over and over again, and each time it still blew you away. You couldn't get over. She was amazing when the one woman show she did was really brilliant. It really was. And George was always amazing when he did a routine about like or using all the tech terms in like under a minute, and it was just like you have to have a very sharp mind to be able to. He was like spitting it out like amazing. So I think that they have inspired me, I would say, and I think it was an honor to be around people that I really did think were incredibly smart and had such an amazing take on the world and everything. So it has influenced me in many ways.
So there's, through your career of storytelling with crime,
Right.
and you're not a comedian, but you worked with
Right.
comedians. Were there any unexpected parallels between comedy and crime storytelling?
Well, what I would say is, I don't know about storytelling, but when I worked at Court TV, we always say we use black humor to offset all the awful things we saw. So
Mm,
a lot of people ask me how I went from comedy to crime. I didn't write comedy. I worked for them in other capacities, but I did still was in the comedic world and then went to the criminal world. And people who know that I say, well, really wasn't much of a leap because with Court TV, we use black humor to such an extent and to alleviate, the horror of everything we were dealing with all the time. So it actually wasn't that big a leap, and everyone, everyone there had an amazing sense of humor. Court TV, and we were always on our game. So it wasn't. If I look at the different jobs, when I worked for Lily, when I worked for Georgia, when I worked for Court TV, it didn't feel that different. And
right.
also George did a whole routine on capital punishment. I mean, they tackled issues like that. So it really wasn't a wide swing at all, as
Yeah,
much as
now
people,
that I'm thinking about it, there's so much social commentary with both of them, right? That
exactly
observational looking at things
right,
and getting us as an audience to question and to be contrarian to the popular way of looking at things. So
right.
I can see where it's interesting. You have such a unique background, but it didn't feel like a big jump to you, right?
No, it did not. When I look back at the jobs, personally look back at them, it doesn't feel that way.
I had a similar thing. I was a chef in my 20s and got into software in my 30s. And people say, "How did you do that?" And you can draw lots of dotted lines. I'd like to talk about because now you write about crime and talk
Right.
about the creative process in crime writing. So when you transitioned from reporting on actual crimes and doing all of that, you did a lot of it, to writing crime thrillers. How did you balance the inspiration from real cases to make sure that your novels had a unique and fictional narratives?
Well, I think what I did is I was originally going to write nonfiction, and then I thought it would be more fun to write
Oh,
fiction. So what I did is I realized that, when you're writing a book, at first you don't realize you can do anything you want. It's all your made up
right,
world. So
right.
I thought, well, I can reference true cases in my book, even though it's fiction. So I did through the protagonist's point of view. I referenced 20 cases that mattered to me in little bits throughout the narrative, because she's loosely based on myself and was a very paranoid woman who always feared she'd be murdered. So it gave the book to me a touch of realism. It
Is
gave the
that
book a
true?
touch.
You're paranoid and always afraid you're going to be murdered?
I had that. I went through that for a very long period of time.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. But I don't feel as much now as I used to. But I think I attribute it to when I was growing up in New York. I remember at the earliest age hearing about all these awful cases, and you'd see the New
Yeah.
York Times and the pictures of the women that were murdered, and it used to freak me out. And I grew up thinking, well, everyone gets murdered, you know. And I think it dissipated once I went away to college. I think it was that in my late teens I felt it the most. But somehow I ended up at Court TV and dealing with crime, so it still sort of stayed with me. And I'm a big victims' rights person and all that, so I think it did impact me an awful lot. But I think writing the books, um, I was able to, I did like some safety tips from cases. Like I did a lot of different things that were therapeutic to me from all my knowledge of covering crime. So it worked really well switching from covering it to writing fictional crime thrillers, because I was able to I figured out how to incorporate the points I wanted to incorporate, including certain cases I felt got neglected and stuff like
Eh,
that.
eh,
And I feel like the second book is from the killer's point of view, and he gets his inspiration from real serial killers, even though he's a fake serial killer.
Yeah, we hear that with shooters now, right?
Right.
They're right, right.
Oh yeah.
You mentioned that you're involved in victims' rights activities. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and what was the genesis of your interest in that?
Well, when I was at Core TV, I always was very deferential to the victims' families. I didn't meet that many of them. I did meet Kim Goldman. She came to Core TV after the last OJ trial. I mean, the murder trial, not the other ones. Um, so I always felt an affinity for the victims, and so there were little ways, like we covered a terrible case, the Carr brothers case in Wichita, Kansas, where I think that's a case a lot of people don't know about, with these five adult friends who they were mainly teachers, lived together, and they were tormented all night and brutally murdered, and it's just a terrible, terrible, terrible case. And I put that in my book, a lot, because I felt that case had been neglected. So
It feels like we pay more attention to victims' rights now than we used to. Is that right or wrong?
I don't know. I mean, it's really hard for me to say which it is. Like we've seen, sometimes they're treated so poorly in court by the judges, the victims'
Oh,
families, which and I think the victim. I always say this: the victim seems to get lost in the shuffle, because the emphasis automatically goes to the person whose life's in the balance now because they're on trial, and the victim's not there, and they're only represented by their friends and family. And I don't know. I think it depends on the case to a very large degree, but I still think overall, because just by the simple fact that the defendant is in court and the victim is not, I think it tends to go to the defendant,
mm.
the attention.
I want to talk about like your personal reflections and like ethical considerations. So you have an extensive career in very high profile murder cases. Have there been moments where you were particularly challenged, maybe ethically or emotionally?
I don't think I was ever challenged emotionally, for sure. There's certain cases, the Carr brothers case in Wichita, and Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom's murders in Knoxville, Tennessee, emotionally affected me unbelievably. Also, Danny Rolling, the Gainesville killer, if people know who he is, in 1990, he killed 5 students in Gainesville, Florida. Those cases emotionally, I mean, there's no way for them not to affect you. You see the families, you deal with the, I dealt with only so many families because I didn't go in the field that much, but you still saw them in court every day. We watched the trial all day long. We were covering it and doing chirons and graphics and all that stuff. So there's no way to separate your emotions. I guess it's similar to the doctors are supposed to and things like that. But some of these cases are just so awful. And we always say there's like a huge ripple effect. Like the victim is the one who's killed, but then it affects their family, their friends, the whole community. When the Carr brothers case happened and it was a home invasion case, everyone in Kansas was putting alarm systems in their homes. They were afraid to go outside. Even one murder has an enormous impact on a
Yeah.
lot of people.
So you were kind of conscious of the balance between like reporting the facts and then being respectful to the victims, and especially as
Yeah.
things become very sensationalized in the media?
Yeah, like getting back to the previous question, like when we cover the Carr brothers case, some of the family members reached out to us and wanted us to use a certain picture of their loved one that had been murdered,
Oh,
and I couldn't do it fast enough. Like I thought, what a little request, what a little ask, where these people their lives are destroyed, and so in little ways like that, that's how I tried to help the families. The main victim thing in terms of an organization that I'm getting involved in are the dog meat trade organizations fighting the dog meat trade. And I've been helping with those organizations. But when I actually worked at Court TV and on Nancy's show, any request from a relative or friend of a victim, I couldn't do it fast enough to help them, because any little piece, I feel like, as I said, their lives have been destroyed. Any little piece, it makes them feel better if they see a certain picture. Maybe it's their favorite picture of them or something on the screen versus some random thing we would pick out. So that's the kind of stuff I tried to do in covering. So I didn't feel I had an ethical. I deferred to the victims always. So I didn't feel I had any ethical. And I wouldn't mind fighting for what I believed we should put on air and how we should do it and all that.
What was it like around the production table in the morning?
Every Monday we would have what we call trial tracking meetings. This is at Court TV, and we would have two packets with about 20 cases in each. And there was a handful of people who picked the trials. So we would sit around and go through them, and some of them were so gruesome. Like I always say to people, the stuff we didn't put on the air was so much worse than what we did put on, because TV still has sort of like rules, like you can't just put anything on. So there were certain things we just couldn't cover. Not that we didn't cover a lot of gruesome things at the end of the day anyway, because most murders are obviously gruesome. And we would all have our say in why we thought a case should be covered, or what we thought was important about it. We did try to do a service. Like Court TV sort of started as a mom and pop thing, and it blew up. And I think it is a huge part of why true crime became. I think if there had never been a Court TV, I don't know if true crime had brought, like OJ was preempting all the soap operas during the day. I mean, it really took over. And I always wonder if there had never been a Court TV, if Steve Brill had never founded it and started it, where would we be with true crime today? It's just an interesting thought. But I
Wow.
think that people do really get into it for sure. It's captivating. It's just
Thank you
something that they get drawn
for
into.
helping us understand this broad genre and helping the audience understand. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure.